Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now, a weekly exploration into one key issue currently shaping Israel and the Jewish world. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with two Jewish student leaders from Columbia University, Eden Yadegar, the president of Students Supporting Israel, and Elisha Baker, a senior editor at the Columbia Political Review. Thank you both for joining me during this very eventful week.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
We are going to discuss the pro-Palestine encampment that has sparked a wave of copycat protests throughout campuses in the United States, but will also set the scene on the Columbia campus leading up to these protests and hear about an atmosphere in which anti-Semitism has been released from its cage since and even before the October 7th Hamas onslaught on southern Israel, in which terrorists massacred 1,200 and took 253 individuals hostage. All this and more when we're back. Police cleared 30 to 40 people from inside Columbia University's Hamilton Hall on Tuesday night after protesters against Israel occupied the administration building earlier in the day. Hundreds of New York Police Department officers acted after the school's president said there was no other way to ensure safety and restore order on campus. The confrontation occurred more than 12 hours after the demonstrators took over Hamilton Hall shortly after midnight on Tuesday. Now, Elisha, let's begin with you. You 2 weeks ago were kicked and almost burned in a previous campus protest. And tell us what you witnessed on Tuesday night. What was the atmosphere like? Was it comparable in terms of its violence? What happened?
Yeah, so, this has been building up since the encampment, right? They've been sneaking people in and out of campus. They've been using more violent rhetoric. There have been assaults and harassment on campus, including Jewish students who were actually singing Matisyahu's One Day and Vehisha Amda, while somebody held up a sign saying Al-Qassam's next targets, threw water in their face, and actually one of my friends had his Israeli flags ripped out of his hands. They tried to burn it, and when he went to get it back, they threw rocks or water bottles at him, including hitting him in the face. And so what happened on Tuesday night was a continuation of this and an escalation of this, right? The university tried to negotiate, and it became clear that these were not, on the part of the protesters, good faith negotiations. So what happened was we started seeing that they had smashed the windows of Hamilton Hall, which at Columbia is one of the main academic buildings. And they actually ran into multiple facilities, maintenance workers, and there was a confrontation. And it might have even happened that they actually held the guy hostage for a few minutes before letting him out. Definitely there was a confrontation there. And they started barricading themselves in as the rest of the movement came over, screaming in support and making a human chain in front of the doors to make sure that nobody could get in. And by the time that I got to campus, we were seeing people through the windows hanging banners, including one massive banner that said Intifada from one of the main windows right in front, and, hanging Free Palestine from the river to the sea, glory to our martyrs in the windows, as they were also closing the shades so that nobody could see them through the windows. So as I was watching this unfold, I'm seeing people, again, barricading, hanging things out the window, closing windows, and basically what we were seeing was a hostile takeover of the building in action.
So there are dozens, hundreds of people inside the building and dozens, if not hundreds, outside the building witnessing this?
So I believe there were dozens inside the building. The encampment negotiators said, this was an autonomous group of rogue agents that, maybe weren't affiliated with the encampment. To me, that's a little bit of a disingenuous claim because right after they took over, hundreds of people, all of whom had been circling the encampment or inside of the encampment, screaming these same chants, moved over to the front of the building. And from inside the building, there were people leading chants, and outside they were the call and response, right? So you were hearing, from the river to the sea coming from somebody inside, or somebody standing on actually on the Alexander Hamilton statue right outside the building. And then the rest of the movement calls, from the river to the sea, and then Palestine will be free the same way they normally do. So again, this was a continuation, and it effectively, instead of listening to the university's, call to leave the encampment actually that day by 2 p.m., they escalated further, took the building, which obviously takes and vandalized it, which obviously takes this to a whole new level. And it's the same movement.
And is the supposition that these are actually students, or are we thinking that there could be some outside forces in here?
That's a good question, especially since this encampment. It's been really hard to know because they're all wearing masks, and because Colombia's public safety was not doing a good enough job at actually checking IDs. So, we would go up to public safety officers and say, hey, we actually watched that person sneak in. Or, they would even post actually on their Instagram and say, we're bringing these guests in to speak in the encampment. And we'd call public safety and say, hey, there are outsiders coming in. We don't know how. They're either sneaking between the gates or they're being let in through doors when public safety is not watching. So, hey, could you go please check IDs? And we were actually told, no, we actually can't go into the encampment, which of course to me was baffling because that's their job. But so since the encampment, we don't know the people in our campus, whether they're students or whether they're outsiders. And at the end of the day, they're all dressed the same, and we have to just be treating them as one unified group.
And right now, Hamilton Hall has been evacuated, but the encampment remains. I
believe the encampment has been evacuated as well. Hamilton Hall has been cleared. It's about time that this happened. And again, this is a long time coming. This is enforcement of policy. And of course, we would have loved to see actions before this that would have maybe prevented something like this from happening. But at the end of the day, this needed to happen, and it's a good thing that it did.
Okay, we are recording on Wednesday, May 1st. This is obviously a changing story. Please check out the Times of Israel website for more updates. Eden, you testified in March at a Congressional House Committee on Education and the Workforce. And so you already raised an alarm in March, but it's an alarm that you raised even before March. Tell us what has been happening since October 7th. Let's begin with that on campus.
Well, like you said, Jewish students at Columbia and across the country have been sounding this very alarm for months since October 7th. And like Lishi said, this could have all been prevented if our university had some moral courage and actually enforced the policies that they claim to stand by. And they haven't done that. So immediately after October 7th, we saw an Israeli student get physically assaulted on campus. We had mass protests calling for violence not only against the state of Israel, but also against Jewish people. And so when we saw this sort of escalation immediately after October 7th, it became very obvious to the Jewish community at Columbia that if our administration didn't step in, it would only further escalate and people would continue to get hurt and violence would continue to ensue. And that's exactly what we've been seeing since then. This hasn't really come as a surprise to the Jewish community at Columbia, unfortunately, because our administration has conditioned the student body to believe that actions don't have consequences. I mean, I think a very clear example of this is in the instance of the Resistance 101 workshop that we saw, in which people affiliated with the PFLP, a designated terrorist organization, spoke at Columbia, and students subsequently were suspended as a result. But A, that only came after massive media attention. And B, I think all but one of those suspensions were lifted immediately. So Columbia claims that they are committed to combating anti-Semitism, to ensuring a safe learning environment for everyone, but really their actions don't match their rhetoric. And so what we've seen the last 2 weeks on campus with the encampment and the subsequent occupation of Hamilton Hall was bound to happen at some point, really. I mean, these protesters have no limits, have no boundaries, and a big part of that is because Columbia hasn't set any limits or boundaries. The red line has been pushed back time and time again. And instead of shutting down the encampment immediately, Columbia actually began to negotiate, like Lishi said, with representatives of the encampment. I mean, as kids, one of the first things that we're taught is, we don't negotiate with terrorists, right? If you throw a temper tantrum, you're not going to get the ice cream cone. You're not going to get what you want. But Colombia has effectively allowed this mob, or until Tuesday night, allowed this mob to take control of the university, push Jewish students and ultimately all students off of campus. And it is a direct result of Colombia's lack of action.
Colombia is, of course, very well known for inviting controversy. Of course, there was the well-publicized speech by the former Iranian President Ahmadinejad many years ago, probably, hopefully not before you were born, but many, many years ago. And you, Eden, as the daughter of Iranian parents, did your parents have any qualms in sending you to this campus even before what we're seeing began happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I got accepted to Columbia, I was warned by almost every single one of my relatives that it was known to be one of the most anti-Semitic campuses in America, and that I should heavily assess if that's an environment that I want to put myself in. And I thought, how bad can it possibly be, right? Like, it's America in 2021 at the time. Sure, anti-Semitism exists, but it's not like it's going to be threatening me on the daily. And for the first 2 years, in some capacity, that was very true. I had run into anti-Semitism in the classroom, definitely, especially as a Middle East studies major, but not so much being bombarded by it in my daily life. It wasn't in social clubs. It wasn't overtaking my entire social life the way that, now I've lost the majority of my non-Jewish friends. They literally don't speak to me because of my Judaism and because of my Zionism. But absolutely, it was a concern. And it has been bubbling under the surface for years, if not for decades at this point at Columbia and kind of, in institutions across America. And I think such an acute example of that is one of the leaders of the Gaza Solidarity encampment was a video of him from January saying that Zionists don't deserve to live, that they should all be killed, recently went viral on social media and was picked up by mainstream media as well. But what I find more troubling than the content of what this student said was the fact that representatives of the university actually heard him say those things in a disciplinary meeting or informal hearing back in January, and they found it excusable. And to me, that is an indication that this institution is fundamentally broken and that anti-Semitism has been swept under the rug and excused for years. I find it so appalling that representatives of the administration literally heard a student say that there's nothing wrong with calling for the murder of Zionists. And they thought, oh, that's fine. This student doesn't deserve to be punished. This student doesn't pose a threat to others on campus. The student isn't a vehement racist because, in essence, anti-Semitism is racism and prejudice. And they completely excused it. And so, like you said, this is an issue that, though is now coming to the surface following October 7th, has been brewing in our universities and in America for a long time.
Elisha, I see that you're wearing a kippah, a yarmulke. I don't know if that's something that you have always worn or if it's something that you've put on recently. Is it something that you've worn a long time?
The truth is, in high school, I had a little bit of a rebellious phase, as I'm sure many people did. And I probably, despite my parents, stopped wearing it. But quickly at Columbia, it has become, again, it's only my second year here, and it's become so important to me to be proud to be Jewish openly. So what that meant right after October 7th was I wore an Israeli flag as a cape, like a 3x5 Israeli flag around campus, because I wasn't scared in that moment, and I know a lot of people were, and I felt like it was a good way to model there are friendly faces here. And the kippah has been obviously a great continuation of that. So I keep that on everywhere I go.
You said in the past tense, I wasn't scared in that moment. And has that feeling changed since then?
It has changed. People talked about safety on campus for the entire time, right? Do you feel safe on campus with the protests? Do you feel safe with the kind of rhetoric that's going around? And the truth is there were mixed answers. from a lot of people, right? I understand why many people were feeling unsafe. And I felt personally that, and many of my friends did as well, that, we could handle ourselves. And at the end of the day, this was really harmful rhetoric that we needed to call out. And these were threats for real, right? But, as individuals on campus, I would say I felt in the past tense safe. Since the encampment, the media wants to try and portray it as peaceful. It happens to be that the media is let in only from 2 or was let in only from 2 to 4 p.m. It was relatively calm at 2 to 4 p.m. That's true. When the sun went down and when the group Within Our Lifetime, which is, designated by the ADL to be very much supporting terrorism, organizes these rallies where they're right outside the gates and working with the people inside to come in and out. And by the way, I have to walk out of the gates to get to my Columbia dorm anyways. So to me, it's all part of campus. There have been assaults, full blown, and it becomes actually an imminent threat to personal physical safety that I hadn't felt for 6 months prior, even though I understand why many people did.
As long as it was sticks and stones may break my bones, names can't hurt me. Of course, the rhetoric is harmful, but it sounds as if the rhetoric itself wasn't being paid attention to. And we've heard, of course, from you both that the president or that the campus hasn't done enough, but it kind of sounds as if it's beyond the campus's borders at this point. And it sounds almost as if the city of New York should have been stepping up a little bit more. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. I mean, like Eden said, we have been sounding the alarm. And if you look back at statements we've made, either as groups, I also co-chair a group called Aryeh, which is obviously Hebrew for lion. We're the Columbia Lions. And the statements that we've made as a group and with Students Supporting Israel and with Hillel, and obviously the op-eds that we've written and the statements we've made to media, we've been sounding the alarm. There was a protest at Columbia on October 12th, which was 15 days before the IDF entered Gaza, in which people were calling for a free Palestine from the river to the sea. They were calling for end to Israeli military action, right? That should be concerning. And we knew from the very beginning that this was not about a war in Gaza. This was a much deeper existential issue that obviously ties to the existence of the state of Israel and Zionism as an identity. So from an educational standpoint, the university actually should have stepped in and done their job to educate people, right? If this is going to become all of a sudden on the forefront of everyone's minds, where was the university in trying to teach people about the really complex history and, nuance of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? What happened in 1948? What happened in 1967 and beyond, right? From a city standpoint, I think, and from a total leadership standpoint, there's also something to be said about the fact that we were calling it out in the first place and the fact that our callouts were ignored, right? Like we said, we sounded the alarm. We said these are threats. When you call for Intifada on the streets of New York, that is a threat to Jews everywhere because we understand what the Intifadas were. And we were told repeatedly, no, you're interpreting it wrong. The Arabic root of Intifada is nafada, which means shaking things up. And therefore, what we're talking about is just shaking up the status quo. Obviously, the natural next question is, what does that look like? And how can you justify that in the context of October 7th being your model for Palestinian resistance? And nobody really has good answers for that. Stop accusing me of supporting violence. That's rude, or that's a misunderstanding. But again, we were told that we were experiencing threats and that our experience of threats was a product of our own misunderstanding. And to me, that should have been something that people latched onto.
Who is telling you this? Who is we were told? Who is the telling?
So, for me personally, I have relationships with people across the ideological spectrum, including actually one of the leaders of the Columbia University Apartheid Divest movement. And I sat with him a lot, right? Weekly even, to discuss history, to discuss narrative, to learn about his family story, for him to hear about my story and about the Jewish story. And one of the things that I would say is, it's crossing a line when you call for intifada. We need to shut that rhetoric down, because this is how I experience it. This is how Jews everywhere experience that. And like, you don't, and like, whether you like it or not, you are setting the groundwork for potential real violence against Jews. And by the way, this is our I told you so moment. But his response often was, this is the etymological root of intifada. I don't support violence vaguely. And, you're misinterpreting intifada, and your historical interpretation of it is wrong. And yeah, again, that was concerning to me, especially also as a Middle East history major and somebody who, and by the way, I'm studying Arabic too. Etymological roots can't just be used to erase the meaning and erase the history of certain words. It's true that words and the meaning of words changes over time due to their use and their connotations. So that was a major issue that we were seeing. And again, I experienced it firsthand in conversations with a major leader of the other side. And I shared these concerns actually with leaders of the university, and they understood, but nothing was said about the fact that Jewish students are being gaslighted to believe that the threats against them were not real.
Eden, your raising the alarm was, of course, televised. It was before Congress, a congressional hearing. And how was your reception back at campus after you told the world what is going on?
So what I shared in Congress wasn't necessarily anything new. It wasn't anything that the entire Jewish community hadn't been screaming about for months, really. I testified on February 29th. So between October 7th and February 29th, Jewish and Israeli students had been, like she said, not only targeted and isolated and shut out of campus life, but also gaslit to believe that none of this was actually happening to us, which I think was one of the most painful parts. But when I got back to Columbia, I really expected that speaking to Congress about these issues would finally set off the alarm for the Columbia administration, because until that point, it felt like we as Jewish student leaders had tried every other avenue. And so I really went into it with hopes that our administration would finally listen and finally stop sweeping our pleas under the rug. And I was proven incredibly wrong. Hardly anything changed after I spoke to Congress. In fact, I could argue that things actually got worse. The rhetoric escalated. Obviously, the situation on campus the last couple weeks has been simply appalling. And what I find actually even more appalling is that this encampment was erected on the same day that the president of Columbia testified before the same congressional committee that I addressed. And it was the first time that Columbia finally admitted that they have an anti-Semitism problem. And the response from this so-called self-proclaimed pro-Palestine movement was to wreak even more anti-Semitism on campus and to wreak havoc on campus for everyone. And again, to me, this is the essence of this movement that claims to be pro-Palestinian, that I can't even call pro-Palestinian because they're rejecting offers to invest in infrastructure and healthcare in Gaza and the West Bank that the university is proposing. They are refusing to engage with the majority of Zionist students and student leaders, myself included. They are shutting things down rather than building things up. And so it didn't come as a surprise when, after addressing Congress, I was harassed by many of my peers, online and in person. I've been screamed at on campus, told I'm disgusting and a colonizer. I've had people threaten me online anonymously with pictures of my face and my full name. And unfortunately, I'm not the only Jewish student that has experienced this. I think a handful of us have, some to a much worse degree than I actually have, which is what's also so frightening. But again, we've gotten to a point where we have lost hope in our administration to actually take the weight of this anti-Semitism problem seriously. And the first time that we saw them actually address it was on Tuesday night. And it's my belief that it was only because it was made a university-wide issue. When these students occupied a building and vandalized and desecrated Columbia property, they were no longer just targeting Jewish students. They were shutting down campus life effectively, targeting Columbia and targeting all Columbia students. And so Columbia really didn't have a choice but to intervene. But when it's about Jewish students, Columbia has proven to us that they simply will not step in.
Where do we go from here? American campuses just seem like scary places to me. I have 3 children in the IDF right now, and I am so glad they're in the IDF and not on campuses in the United States, because that just seems like a world of hate that shouldn't be occurring. Where do you go from here? Do you stay at Columbia? Do you stick it out? What are your plans for the future?
I mean, there's a quick answer and there's a long answer. The quick answer is we stick it out, because to leave is to let the bully win, right? And one thing that I want to make very clear that's very important to me as a member of the Jewish people is that the lesson that we learn from the state of Israel, both from the pre-establishment, establishment, and the last 75 years, is the Jewish people remain strong when we stand our ground in unfriendly neighborhoods. That is the lesson of the state of Israel, in my opinion, right? I mean, what could be a more unfriendly neighborhood than the Middle East, right? For Jews and for Israel. I mean, we see that almost every day. And as a Jewish student in America, obviously, lahavdil, it's not the same. But again, it's become an unfriendly neighborhood. And if we just leave, if we just give up, if we just, lay down our story and say, you're right, they don't want us here, so let's go somewhere else, I feel like that's letting down the Jewish people. I feel like it's admitting weakness. And again, I think it's also failing the story. It's failing the story of Israel and the story of the Jewish people that we want to continue telling and aspiring to tell going forwards.
Eden, what about you?
I agree with Lishi on the one hand that leaving these spaces would be a complete betrayal of the Jewish tradition, in my view. But on the other hand, I cannot in good faith look an 18-year-old American Jew in the eyes and tell them that Columbia is going to keep them safe, because Columbia has proven that they will not do that. And this isn't just about Columbia. Of course, this is our experience, so it's what we're able to speak to, but this is an issue plaguing universities across the country. And so on one hand, I don't want to surrender these spaces that we have worked so hard to get to what is really an angry mob. But on the other hand, if those in leadership are unwilling to lead and unwilling to protect Jewish students, it puts us in a situation where why would we expose ourselves to that? Why would we put ourselves in a situation where we are going to be so vulnerable when we have a homeland that is going to protect us and keep us safe and welcome us with open arms? And it's something that I am personally really internally struggling with, and I think a lot of us are. You are very inspiring to me. I really appreciate that you gave me so much of your time. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Amanda.
Really a pleasure. Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email at podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.